Hey everyone, it's the Chess Playing Pediatrician here. I really appreciate the input from my last couple of videos. I would love it if you would like and subscribe to my channel if you have enjoyed the last couple of my videos. Today I wanted to talk through a game that I played recently with a good friend of mine. This is a friend that I had beaten earlier, and I went into this game feeling pretty confident. I was overconfident and ended up making a couple of key mistakes earlier in the game. This kind of put me in a not so good position initially, and then I eventually kind of started to recover, but then he eventually used a play against me called a knight fork that he used to check my king, and that opened up the game for him to get some pawns down to my side and get his queen back and eventually win the game. And I think the knight fork, it's a really kind of hard play to see coming, and it's really effective if you can use it against your opponent. So I kind of wanted to just talk through this play, and then I'll show some examples of a knight fork, and then I will move on to this game that I played against my friend where he beat me with this play. A knight fork is essentially when you move your knight in a position where he is attacking two different pieces at the same time. This is a really effective play, especially if you use it to put the king in check, where you have the king on one end of the fork and then another piece on the other end of a fork. And in that situation, because you're in check, you really can't do anything to avoid losing the piece on the other side of the fork. So I'm going to show you an example of that right here. All right, so this here is the first example I'm going to show of a knight fork. So you see right here, you have white. They have their bishop right here protecting this square. And you also have this knight here aimed right at this square. And so right now it's white's move. So what white is going to do is he's going to move his bishop from g5 to f7. And you see what this does is it puts the black side in position where they can't take that knight with the king because he's protected by the bishop there. And then this is where you have the fork. So you see the knight right now is threatening both the rook and the queen here. And so really there's nothing that the black player can do in this situation to avoid losing either the rook or the queen. So for example, you see if you have the queen move up to d7 to threaten that knight, then the knight can just move and take the rook there. So that's a pretty classic example of this play that I'm going to show. And then I have one more example here where you can use a knight fork to check the king to take one of your opponent's pieces. So for this other example, I'm going to flip the board around here. Okay, and for the second example is an example of using a knight fork to check the king. So what you have here, you see you have the white player's knight here at d5. You have the black player's king at its initial position here at e8. You have the black player's queen here at a2. And then you have the black player's rook here at its initial position at a8. So it's white's move right now. So what white is going to do is they're going to move their knight to c7. And see, in this position, you have the knight that is checking the king, but is also at the same time threatening both the queen and the rook. So because the black player's in check, there's nothing that he can do to lose his queen or his rook. The black player has to move out of check, which in this situation, the only thing he can do is move from e8 to d8. And then you have your knight who's open to either take the queen or the rook, like that. So as I mentioned before, for this game, my opponent very expertly used a knight fork to check my king towards the end of the game, which eventually allowed him to free up some of his pawns, which enabled him to get his queen back kind of at the very end of the game to end up winning the game. So I'm just going to kind of quickly walk through the earlier stages of this game. So my opponent starts out by playing king's pawns game. I respond with my king's pawn, and then he is playing pretty aggressive. He gets his queen out really early, as you can see there. And then I respond by protecting my king's pawn with my knight there. And then continuing his kind of aggressive strategy here, he immediately goes and threatens my knight with his bishop there. And then at this point, I know my bishop's protected, and so, or I'm sorry, I know that my knight is protected from his bishop by these two pawns here. So I move my other knight out to threaten his queen. And then he moves his queen to this safe space right there. And then my next move here was really kind of my first mistake of the game. So I use my queen's rook side pawn to threaten his bishop. And what I should have done there is used my queen's pawn to protect my king's pawn here. So I should have moved my queen's pawn up one space to protect my king's pawn. And the reason for that is this bishop is already, this knight is already protected by this other pawn. Whereas if I lose this knight, then I don't have any pieces protecting my king's pawn here. So what happens here now is my opponent's bishop takes my knight, and then I don't have any pieces protecting my king's pawn here. And so at this point, the best option for me is to take, or at least the best option that I could see was to take my opponent's bishop. But that frees him to take my king's pawn here and put my king in check. And then this obviously isn't like a huge game-ending situation, but it really kind of puts me on the run from from the beginning of the game. And so I'm just going to kind of run through the next kind of middle part of the game pretty quickly. So he's really, for the most part of the early part of the game, he kind of has me on the run, and I'm just trying to defend. And again, I'm just kind of trying to rush through this middle part here. And so at this point, I feel like the best situation for me is to offer to trade queens with him. So I move my queen out here to threaten his queen, and then he takes my queen, and then I take his queen for a queen trade. And then again, the rest of the game is this is the point where I feel like I kind of recovered, and I started to finally get to a point where I could kind of turn the tables and take the offensive. So he castles on his queen side there, and then so my objective here is to kind of move my offensive over here towards the right side, or toward his queen side of the board. So right here, I'm kind of aiming for these pawns to try to get access to the queen this way. And then I set up this, this rook stack here to try to aim for this pawn. And then he moves his bishop there to protect that pawn. And then then he moves his knight here to protect that pawn. And then I threaten his knight with my bishop there. And then he protects his knight with his pawn. I take his knight with my bishop. He responds by taking my bishop with his pawn. And that gives me the opportunity to get right to this weak square where I wanted, like that. And so then he responds by moving his king out of the way, so he can kind of respond to this attack by setting up his stacked rooks to aim for this square here. And And then I respond by trying to set up another rook stack, aiming at this piece right here to try to put him in check. So here we have, we both have kind of our rook stacks here, me aiming at this square and then him defending with this rook stack here in the back. So he ends up taking my rook, and then I take his rook. And this actually puts me in kind of an awkward position, because I don't want to move this rook out of the way, because if he gets his rook here, then, on the next move, he could potentially get his rook back here and, go after my king. So my objective at this point was to try to put myself in a position where I could check this square. So I did that. Over the next few moves, you'll see. And I guess before that, he's now advanced his pawns to kind of put my king in danger here. So I'm just trying to, at this point, I'm just trying to get my king out of the way. He responds by going after my king with his knight. I try to, again, kind of get my king more on this side of the board where he's less threatened. He takes my pawn and checks my king. And then this again, and at this point, he kind of has me on the run again. Because he has these pawns that, are pretty close to getting to my side of the board so that he can get his queen back. So I respond by threatening his knight with my king. He retreats with his knight. And then, again, I am aiming for this square eventually. So kind of my plan was to move my knight from here to here, from here to here. And then on the next play, I could, check his king right there. So we'll kind of see how that played out. So he then moves to take out my pawn here, which again gives him an advantage on this side because he has these two pawns that are, almost on my side of the board here. And then, but this gives me an opening to do what I was planning on doing, which was attacking that square there so I can put his king in check on the next move. And then he responds by moving his knight out of the way and also threatening my knight. And then I respond by checking his king there. And then at this point, he goes out of check by moving his king back to his back row there. And then his next move there, or I'm sorry. So then my objective now was I'm aiming for this rook. I figure that if I can take out his rook, he'll be left with just his knight. He could take my knight there, but then it would be, my rook against his knight, which, usually the rook is a more valuable piece than the knight usually. And so my plan right here, which ended up being, not the best plan, was to aim for his rook right here. So I move my rook back here with the idea of putting him in check. And then once he moves out of the way, I would take his rook there. And he responds by taking my knight. And what I didn't see here is that on his next move, he is free to check my king with his knight. So he could move his knight from here to here. And that, kind of as we talked about earlier, that sets up a knight fork. So he has he would have my king checked. If he moved his knight here, he'd have my king checked here, but he would also be able to attack one of these two pawns. And then on the next move, there wouldn't be anything that I could really do to stop him from taking this pawn. And then that would free up not only these two pawns, but also this pawn to get to my back row and eventually get his queen back. And that ended up being how he beat me. So you see on my next move here, I check his king, and then the only thing for him to do is move his king out of the way, and that frees me up to take his rook. And at this point, I was confident that I had won the game. But again, as I mentioned, I didn't see this knight fork here that he was able to do. So you see he has me in a fork right here. His knight is both checking my king, but it's also aiming for one of those two pawns. So at that point, the only thing I can do is move my king. I decide to move my king over here to help defend my back row against these two pawns. And then he takes my my pawn with his knight there. And then if you see here, there's nothing that I can do now to stop him from taking this pawn on his next move. So, but I'm, trying to take out these pawns because they're getting close to my back row. And so I start attacking those pawns, and then he takes out my pawn there, which frees up this pawn. And then on my next move, I check the king. He responds obviously by moving his king out of the way. And then I start trying to take out some of his back pawns so that I can eventually take out some of the more forward pawns and free up my pawns to go and get to his back row and get my queen back. But at that point, he's able to take my other pawn and also move his knight out of the way to free up this pawn. And at that point, there really wasn't a whole lot I could do. The game was practically his win at this point. And so, I kind of, I probably should have resigned at this point, but I was stubborn and tried to fight it out. So I put his king in check again. And then I again check his king, and maybe a different thing I could have done is moved my rook here to attack this pawn and then eventually have access to this pawn here. But he could have just easily protected that pawn with his king. So even that probably would have been futile. But anyway, so I check his king again, moves out of the way. I aim for that row of pawns, but again, there's at this point nothing I can really do to stop him from getting his pawn to my back row and getting his queen back. And really it was, his game from there. He ends up, getting a second queen. And at that point, it was just a few more moves until he had me in checkmate. So there you have it. The knight fork is a very powerful play in chess. It can be very difficult to see coming. It can be very effective if you use it against your opponent. So definitely watch out for it and look for opportunities to use it when you're playing chess. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time on the Chess Playing Pediatrician.